If this is your first time listening to our podcast, welcome. Our programming brings a diversity of voices connected to Myanmar to share their perspectives, thoughts, and reflections about what has been happening there since the military coup. All of our guests share one thing in common: a deep personal stake in the ongoing crisis. And it's an honor for us to be able to bring their voices into your earbuds. But however difficult it may be to hear some of their stories, we hope that you'll come away with a deeper and more nuanced understanding of what's happening there. Let's listen in. We're pleased on this episode of Insight Myanmar Podcast to be joined by Chris Gunness. He is a veteran journalist and human rights advocate whose reporting for BBC during the 1988 pro-democracy uprising became a vital lifeline of information for millions inside the country. Chris was branded an enemy of the state by the military regime for his coverage at the time and has since gone on to champion international justice as director of the Myanmar Accountability Project, or MAP, which is working to prosecute atrocity crimes committed by the junta. With that, Chris, thank you so much for joining us on the conversation that follows.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Before we get into these events of 1988, I want to step back to a quieter time before it all erupted, because you were one of the few foreign correspondents watching Burma closely before that uprising. This was a time pre-1988, as a previous podcast guest we had on, Dominic Folder, put it, quote, nobody even knew where it was. And that's not really an exaggeration. This was a closed country. It was largely off of the international press radar, if we go back and remember those pre-88 days, and where even, as Dominic said on our podcast, the burning down of a major city like Mandalay in one case could go unreported for weeks. You yourself has said that you were drawn to Burma because it was a quote, information black hole. This was a place where simply reporting what was happening itself could be a radical act. And so my question is, as we move to set up what happened in 88 and looking at the months and years before, what was it that first pulled your attention into this, so-called forgotten country? And what were the threads, early contacts, or instincts that made you want to dig deeper long before the rest of the world was paying attention and before there was really something big to pay attention to?
There are many headlines about Myanmar which really predate the involvement of myself and others in 1988. It was the world's longest running civil war. It was one of the greatest sources of drugs, of transnational crime, of refugees. It is the source of so much regional and global instability, and frankly has been that since 1948, since independence from Britain. Indeed, many of the problems now besetting Myanmar, Burma as it then was, were bequeathed by the evils of British colonialism. One small but very significant example, I say small example, it's because it's one amongst many, not because it's insignificant, it's extremely significant, and that is the Rohingya issue. The British, when they handed over the state, they did not deem it necessary to invite the Rohingya to the Panglong Conference. And this was a conference which was basically saying, here are the groups to the post-independence government that matter. These are the ones who are crucially part of the political dispensation in the period, in the decades to come. And many would say that the prejudice and the hatred that fueled the ongoing genocide against the Rohingya dates back to that decision by the British effectively to exclude them, because it's that sense of exclusion, the 1982 Citizens Act, which excludes them, which is very much of the making of British colonialism. And that's, I think, just one example of what drew me to this conflict, this crisis, this country. It is the source of so much instability regionally and internationally. And it seems to me that if the region is to have peace and stability, then the fundamental and decades-long questions that confront Myanmar, Burma, have to be addressed. And the sooner the regional powers and the sooner that the permanent members of the Security Council, two of whom, Russia and China, have been blocking progress, have been blocking international attempts to address these underlying issues that affect Myanmar, the greater the chances are that these problems are going to endure. So it is very much the underlying sources of the instability that's gone on for decades in Myanmar that drew me to the country. And that's just to mention the geopolitics. It is an extraordinarily fascinating country in and of itself, a patchwork of over 130 nationalities, ethnic nationalities, each with their own distinct cuisines, their languages, their cultures, their literature. It is a place which is endlessly fascinating, and it certainly was to me as a cub reporter for the BBC when I first started writing about Myanmar, Burma, as it then was, in 1986, 1987, and eventually in 1988 when I actually went there, not for the first time, because I'd been before as a tourist, but for the first time as a journalist.
You became one of the first foreign journalists to report that mass protests that were, and actually to learn about it in advance, that were being planned for August 8th, 1988 at precisely 8:08 a.m. Myanmar's nothing if not auspicious in every corner and every side of the conflict. And you were able to pick up on this through what was then just whispered knowledge from student organizers. And so can you walk us through how you came to learn about this plan for 8888 and what then led you to make the decision to report on it publicly, how to report on it? And did you grasp at the time just how far-reaching and important the impact of that broadcast was going to turn out to be?
So I have to take you and the listeners back to the last part of 1987. And what happened is that the junta of General Ne Win that had come to power in a left-wing military coup in 1962, bringing into government illegally, because of course it was a coup, the Burma Socialist Programme Party, the BSPP. As I say, it was one of the few left-wing military coups that history has known. And by September 1987, the economic mismanagement of the country by a bunch of generals who basically had no economic expertise whatsoever and had no right to be running what in the 50s was one of the richest economies in Southeast Asia. Myanmar was known as the Rice Bowl of Southeast Asia. And by 1987, it had become the begging bowl of Southeast Asia, thanks to the ruinous economic mismanagement of General Ne Win and his cronies. And what he decided to do in response to galloping inflation was simply to abolish various denominations of chat notes. And because the banking system had collapsed, many people were literally keeping their life savings in a plastic bag underneath their beds. Because they weren't going to put them in the bank because, the banking system was notoriously unreliable. So Ne Win simply woke up one morning and said, I'm going to abolish the following denominations of banknotes. And suddenly, people's life savings were absolutely worthless. And what we began to hear from places like Prome were the first rumblings of public protest. Now, in a country where there had been absolutely no public protest, this, of course, raised eyebrows. And I used to, and my editor, a man called Nick Nugent, who I pay great tribute to because it was his decision to send me there, Nick and others in the BBC's Eastern Service, as it was then, the BBC carved up the world according to the very neo-colonial lines, and there was this thing called the Eastern Service, which was all the countries between Afghanistan and Burma. And the Eastern Service used to follow events very closely. And we began, because we kept in touch with diplomatic sources in what was then Rangoon, Yangon now, to hear about diplomats who'd actually started to pick up sources in their staff, people reporting to their staff about public protests. And this was unheard of since 62. In 26 years, 25 years, people weren't accustomed to the idea of public protest. And in that context, in the first part of 1988, there were some public protests by very, very brave students at Rangoon University, which were viciously put down by the Long Tane, the security apparatus, as they were known, the Long Tane, and they brutally assaulted student protests not far from the campuses in northern Rangoon. And this led to really an explosion of public anger. There was a fight that broke out in a tea shop one night, and that led to some serious violence. And so by about June 1988, perhaps a bit before then, Ne Win realized that he had let a genie out of the bottle, that his demonetization program was disastrous, that it had given rise to the most appalling violence in the country, which his regime had brutally put down. And he announced a party plenum. Now, in those days, the communist parties in Eastern Europe and in Southeast Asia would have these big plenary sessions every 5 years. And this was not after 5 years. This was very much an irregular party plenum. And rumours started to circulate that Ne Win was going to resign, that this party plenum would herald in a period of great change. And so Nick Nugent, my editor, said to me, look, get yourself a tourist visa from the Burmese embassy in London. In those days, it was absolutely impossible to get a working visa as a journalist. I mean, it was like North Korea. They simply weren't going to allow journalists in. So indeed, I went to the Burmese embassy in Mayfair in London, posing as a backpacker, and I got myself a tourist visa. In those days, you could only get a tourist visa for 7 days. And I booked myself in on a flight to Rangoon. I'd actually come from Bangladesh. I was on a reporting trip for the BBC Eastern Service, and it had taken me to Bangladesh, which, by the way, saw the worst floods in living memory. 2/3 of the country was underwater. But in that context, I went off to Burma, and my plan was simply to gather information, as it were, underground, as a tourist, talking to people I could talk to, diplomats, perhaps economists, some academics, who knows. And the night after I got there, Ne Win got up on television and said, I resign. And we are going to have a period of multi-party politics. We're going to have a pluralist economy. Until that moment, the BSPP, the Burma Socialist Programme Party, had pretty much a monopoly on all aspects of the economy. So this was huge news. I mean, this was the Cold War ending in East Asia years and years before the Cold War began to end in Europe. And it was a huge story. And at that point, Nick Nugent, my editor, said, look, you've got to break your cover. You've got to report from Rangoon with a Rangoon dateline, because this simply is such a huge story. There were no other journalists there. To get a visa was going to take days and days, which meant basically the BBC was ahead on the story by really quite a few days. So that's why they took the decision in London that I should break my cover and I should report on the record. The big problem for me is that I was a cub reporter. I was very, very young. It was my first foreign assignment. I'd never really done any on-the-record news reporting on such a big story. So it was with a real sense of trepidation that I filed my first report on the record from the Strand Hotel, which was basically a rat-infested tourist backpackers hotel in Rangoon.
That's an unbelievable story to get that living history. Also, I think that some people might have some familiarity with your your resultant reporting and seeing the BBC coverage at the time, but to really get the backstory of all how that all came about is really quite astounding. And also I appreciate all that setting the scene of talking about Ne Win stepping down, talking about the rampant inflation that was happening. Also even back then, the state of the conflict, the civil war, the drug and narcotics trade at the time. This is all setting that stage. And if this were not dramatic enough, it takes another turn when, as I understand it, you get a mysterious slip placed under your pillow. So take up the story from there, or backtrack if there's some things you need to fill in to make that come more alive.
That's right. I mean, at this point, the story takes on the tenor of a political thriller, because after I'd been in Rangoon literally for 24 hours, I came back to my hotel room, and this is after I'd done my first reports live on the record with the Rangoon Dateline. And underneath my pillow, I found a note saying, "We are the student leaders. We are going to lead a revolution, and we want to tell you about that revolution. Be outside the Sule Pagoda at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." And I really had no idea what this was about. It turned out that a leading human rights lawyer had worked for the family of the receptionist, the hotel telephonist, I should say, in the hotel reception. And she had this note placed under my pillow because of this very foresightful lawyer called Ne Min, who I can tell you about later in the story. He sadly died of COVID many years later. But Ne Min saw that there was an opportunity to get the story of Myanmar out to the world, and a BBC correspondent turning up was the perfect mouthpiece, the perfect megaphone to get that story out. So in a way, he was the grand chess master who had this note placed under my pillow, liaised with the students, and between them, they cooked up this idea of the revolution starting on the 8 minutes past 8 on the 8th of the 8th of 1988. But I get ahead of myself, because what happened is the next morning, I was indeed outside the Sule Pagoda with a little Sony Walkman. Those of you old enough to remember a Sony Walkman, it was a very small, compact little cassette recorder, and I had a tiny mic, because obviously I had to evade military intelligence, MI, who were ubiquitous in those days. Anyway, I was suddenly bundled into a car. I was blindfolded. I was taken off to a safe house in the basement of a house in northern Rangoon. And there I met a group of students. And they explained to me that they were the student leaders. They were incredibly young. They seemed to me slightly naive. At one point, they said to me, "How would you advise us to strategize a revolution?" And I said, "Look, I'm a young reporter. It's your revolution. I'm reporting on you. It's not for me to advise you." But anyway, I, as was the practice in those days, did an interview in English in which I basically covered the strength of the student movement, an idea of the strength of the military arraigned against them, how concerned they were about the military crackdown on their movement, what their strategy is, what their outreach was to the far-flung areas, the so-called periphery of Myanmar. And I did this interview with them in English. And then, because the BBC had the BBC Burmese service, which in those days was hugely popular. I mean, it's not much of an exaggeration to say that most of Burma's 44 million population listened to the BBC Burmese service in those days, especially in days of tension, because the state broadcasters were so distrusted by the vast majority of the population, that the BBC, and to some extent the OA, I think, was basically, they were the only games in town. And I then did the same interview in Burmese. Now, to be very clear and full disclosure, I did not speak Burmese, and to this day, I do not speak Burmese. And in the Burmese version of the interview, one of the students had the foresight to say, our revolution is going to begin at 8 minutes past 8 on the 8th day of the 8th month, August of 1988. Now, this interview was happening in the third week of July. So when it was over, I packed up my bags and I guess I walked out. I got into a taxi. I went straight to the British embassy, and the tapes were smuggled out in diplomatic pouches. I also, in subsequent days, talked to an economist who talked about how the country was in such a desperate parlor state and that more economic suffering was on the way. And I spoke to a soldier who'd come back from the front lines in the ethnic nationality areas. And he talked very powerfully about how the army was using human mine detectors, literally people, children, women, civilians, to walk in front of the soldiers through minefields. They would step on mines and were effectively, as I say, human mine detectors. Amnesty International and other groups had reported on these appalling abuses of human rights, sexual violence, and all sorts of crimes committed, abuses committed against civilians. But here it was coming from a soldier. And I think, given that the narrative then as now from the military has been only the military can protect the union, can protect the people and hold the union of Myanmar together, trust us. And this interview with a military man was so cutting against the narrative that the Burmese people had been drip fed for decades, but which I think many people were extremely suspicious of. But here it was, in the voice of an actual Burmese soldier, an officer, saying to the people what they suspected. And I think the combination of the student interviews, the interview with the banker, and the interview with the military man, smuggled out to the Foreign Office in London in diplomatic pouches, taxied across London to Bush House in the Strand. And then on the 6th of August 1988, they were broadcast back into Myanmar. And suddenly, I, without knowing it, because I had no idea what were in these interviews, they were in Burmese, I didn't understand them, I didn't know what was in them, I had fired the starting gun on a revolution without actually knowing that I had done. So it was an astonishing thing. And of course, by this stage, I was kicked out of the country. The army knew where I was and made it clear to the British ambassador that I had to leave. And so effectively, I was frog marched to the airport and put on a plane, which, because I'd come from Bangladesh, it went back to Bangladesh. I checked into the Sheraton Hotel in Dhaka, and Ne Min, this man I mentioned earlier, who was the person that liaised with the students, had worked with them to come up with the date 8888, and who had contacted me through the switchboard opera in the hotel. He contacted the British ambassador and said, here is my number, give it to Chris Gunness. I am receiving news from all around the country. If he phones me up and gets on the phone to me, I will gather news for him. And so bit by bit, that's what I did. I was very blessed because an Arakanese exile refugee in Dhaka literally knocked on my door one day and said, hello, I gather that you are reporting on Myanmar. I will come and work with you for as much as time per day as you want, and I will be your translator to the various parts of Myanmar, and I will be the interface between you and Ne Min, gathering news. And so in the hotel, in the Sheraton of Dhaka, thanks to the foresight of Ne Min, and thanks to this man called Santapu, who was this extraordinary man. Subsequently, sadly, he has also died. We set up a 3-man news agency. And because every journalist pretty much in Burma was on strike, I mean, what happened was the 1988 revolution turned into a general strike because Burma was a kleptocracy. The army literally had stolen the economy. So the best way the people could hit back against the military was to go on strike. Every journalist in the country was on strike. And when it became known that Ne Min was effectively the pivot to the BBC, he began to get more and more news that was fed to me. And to start with, I was quite distrustful. He was a source I didn't know. And so I wasn't sure whether to trust. But gradually I realized that things that Ne Min was telling me were being corroborated 2 or 3 days later by diplomats. And so increasingly I trusted him. And it was extraordinary that in the morning transmission into Myanmar, pretty much all of it was my reports from Ne Min, although he never took credit for it. And in the evening broadcasts, again, pretty much all of the broadcasts were my reports from Myanmar. So, it quickly became one of these situations where people who'd been starved of news from the north, they didn't know what was going in the south, in the west of the country, they had no idea what was going on elsewhere. Suddenly, the people across Myanmar had a very joined up sense of this nationwide uprising against the much detested and hated military dictatorship. And of course, that added fuel to this revolution that gathered momentum through August and into September. And what actually happened is, I didn't know it at the time, but the dock workers in Rangoon had heard the interviews with the students. And at 8 minutes past 8, they simply downed tools, marched into the city. And by lunchtime, there were millions and millions of people demonstrating in the major cities across Myanmar, across what was then Burma, I should say.
Again, I mean, this is remarkable. So it's your BBC report that, as you mentioned, in a language and details that you didn't even understand the full breadth of, announcing this auspicious time that this strike and protest would start, and with no local media really to rely on, you have these millions of Burmese that are turning in by shortwave. And so when the appointed hour came, you have the dock workers, and then behind them, shopkeepers, students, monks, people from all corners of society that are pouring onto the street at the exact time that it was reported that this will begin. This is a kind of immediate coordinated turnout in a very tightly controlled dictatorship. It's almost unheard of, really, at the time, which is why why we look back to this day as so significant in Myanmar history, obviously. And so when you saw how precisely people acted on that broadcast, I'm curious, how did it shape your understanding of your role as a journalist in that moment? And did it shift your sense of what it meant to report or to intervene in such dramatic times where the mere release of information itself, that could change the course of events?
I have to be very honest here and say that the real heroes of this story are the people of Myanmar, and that it is crazy to believe that a 20-something cub reporter could foment a revolution in a distant country. What went on is that my report simply unleashed, as it were, these very powerful underlying tensions that had lain dormant in the student movement, in Myanmar society, and indeed the army. I mean, you mentioned shopkeepers and others who came onto the streets. There were whole kind of units of the Navy and the army that came onto the streets holding up banners announcing to the people of Myanmar that, they were in the army or the Navy, and they were coming onto the sides of the people. Well, a BBC reporter in his 20s was not going to be able to do that. I mean, my reports may have indicated to the people of Myanmar just how widespread the disaffection was with the regime, but it was the people themselves who risked their lives and came onto the streets to protest. But of course, it is a lesson in public information. And I think the lesson is that people will know the truth, and the truth will set them free. But what sets them free is themselves. It is the people of Myanmar who rose up. It's the people of Myanmar who took steps to set themselves free. And if you were to and let's take our time to get there perhaps, if you were to spool forward to today, it is Gen Z that has led the way. It is the people of Myanmar themselves who are leading the revolution. So, although, yes, it was a real revelation to me about how public advocacy works, and I've spent the rest of my life in public advocacy as a BBC reporter, but also as a United Nations official in Bosnia and in Gaza, in the Middle East, in the West Bank and Syria, in Jordan, Lebanon. Yes, of course, it was a salutary early lesson in the power of public information, but I'm not sort of arrogant or puffed up in any way. I take absolutely no credit for what happened. The credit for the success of that revolution and what it set free and the historical significance of those tumultuous times, all of that is down to the people of Myanmar, the extraordinary brave people of Myanmar.
And I think that another thing that this relates to is just the serendipity of revolutions and conflicts in general. I think when we look back historically, sometimes we can fall into a pattern of just looking at how these things were bound to happen by one event led to another, and almost like there's these people in a room planning that first we're going to do this and this is going to happen, this is going to happen. When you really look into the way that revolutions or conflict starts, it's the serendipity factor is just huge. And I think there is a truth that you can make your own luck, and I think that this is looking at it from the other point of view, from the side of the students. I think it is a factor of serendipity combined with taking advantage of serendipity, that they happened to know a BBC reporter was staying in a hotel where they had access, and then they could take a risk and reach out and make that contact. And this is the way that, serendipity played out in this case. And you found yourself in the center of unfolding world events. And so, in the years after 1988, though, the regime branded you an enemy of the state. You were blacklisted, visa requests denied, your reports publicly denounced, especially the ones that were exposing military abuse and testimony of women who said that they had been raped in custody. But inside Burma, your name was synonymous with BBC. For many Burmese, you were far from a villain. You were a hero. People risked their lives to pass you information, and years later still talk about what it meant to hear that truth, as you say, the truth that will set you free, on the radio. And I know that you've just sent out a disclaimer that this is not really credit that is coming your way. It's the Burmese people leading it. But I would like to ask, when you look back on this now, how do you sit with that dual legacy, reviled by the regime, revered by some of its victims, as well as those democracy activists? And do you in any way feel caught between those identities, or do you feel they were just labels that were thrust upon you in the course of doing what your professional job was?
To be clear, I am an old-fashioned hack. I am a scribbler. I am a journalist. And I make no claims to having changed history. I wear the label of being an enemy of the state and an enemy of the people, as branded by the junta, as a badge of honor, because it's a mark of their own guilt that they are so stupid as to blame a cub reporter for the fact that 44 million people rose up against their misrule, their abuses, their excesses, their economic theft of the huge natural resources of Myanmar. But I completely agree with what you say about the serendipitous nature of revolution. I think one can look very carefully at the events of Myanmar in 1988 and pinpoint some very specific causes. On You Make Your Own Luck, I think we have to give credit to Ne Min, this Rangoon lawyer. He was in his 40s when I met him in Myanmar. He was the one who arranged for me to meet the banker and the soldier. And it was Ne Min who saw that the way to make the revolution happen was to get details of it on the BBC. And it was Ne Min who, throughout the summer of 1988, was processing information in Rangoon and getting it to me. I think it's the bravery of the students who got me to that safe house in Rangoon, and the student in particular who had the foresight to reveal to the nation the exact minute when the revolution was going to happen. So that's the kind of serendipitous aspect. On the other hand, since 1962 and arguably beyond, there had been this wholesale kleptocratic mismanagement of Burma's natural resources. There had been the brutality of the army in the ethnic nationalities areas, as evidenced by countless reports by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and other human rights organizations. So I think it was a concatenation of a multiplicity of tensions and factors and historical accidents that in some way magically combined and combusted to crystallize and produce this big bang that happened at a very, very precise moment. But, I think, as I've just done, I hope, one can look back and analyze, I think, with some exactitude, the reasons, the very precise reasons why these things happen. And my role is really only one very small part of a much bigger jigsaw puzzle.
Sure. And so then I'd like to move the story forward. We've talked about this extraordinary buildup, and then millions falling into the street and pouring into protests and strike movements. And I want to look at what came next, because there was so much promise. And again, if you situate yourself not just in the years 88 to 90 being a Burmaphile, but look at what was happening around the world with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union and apartheid in South Africa and so many other places, there was a sense at this time that Burma was one of those countries among all of these others that was on a pathway to change for the better. That is not what happened. And in some ways, despite that promise, I think there is an argument to be made that things actually got much worse post 88, albeit, it's not a black and white thing. There were it obviously gave rise to larger diaspora communities, activist communities. Activism arose both natively as well as in the West as a result of 88, and Aung San Suu Kyi came on the scene, and there was and it was the birth of a lot of independent media. So it was nuanced in that ways, but things, the promise that 88 was hoping to provide, certainly that's a promise that everyone is still holding their breath on to this day. And so if you could pick up the story and talk about from the time that those millions poured on the street, how did that then result, and what's your view and analysis and looking at the trajectory that it would go on to take?
So the military had a major panic. Ne Win, I think, intentionally unleashed some instability, thinking he could manage it and thinking that he could change the country, unleash all sorts of dynamics that might have economic advantages for the army or whatever. But he thought that by releasing the valve a little, he could still keep his hand on that valve and control it. But of course, he couldn't. And I think he soon realized that. He then tried various tricks. So he imposed a civilian prime minister, Mau Mau, and the people soon saw that for the trick it was. You can't just put a civilian prime minister in charge of a military administration that had been in power for 26 years and expect the people to be so foolish as to believe that suddenly there was civilian rule. So Mau Mau lasted a matter of days. He then, Ne Win, put in charge of Uncle Saw Mau, the butcher of Rangoon, who was a very, very brutal man with a terrible reputation. And in the third week of September 1988, they announced the formation of the SLORC, the State Law and Order Restoration Council. And what happened was there were basically a turkey shoot around Rangoon. And I remember at the time I was on the phone to the American ambassador, and it was about, I think, 4:00 in the afternoon. And I suddenly heard the crack, crack, crack of bullets and the scream of people. And the ambassador said to me, outside the embassy, there's a huge crowd of thousands of unarmed demonstrators, and the army has opened fire into them. And that really was the end of the Glorious Revolution. That was the beginning of the vicious industrial scale repression that was really to characterize the next more than 2 decades, because what then happened is that the army held elections in 1990, Of course, it was very heavily censored and controlled a process. Anybody who looked like they were going to threaten the military, any political powers, any political parties, were not allowed to stand. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. I mean, it's happened so many times in Myanmar. And then when the army realized that couldn't happen, Myanmar really was slammed in the deep freeze by the army. Foreign reporters were thrown out. There was really no news story in the sense, the whole thing, as I say, Burma was put in the deep freeze by the military until Cyclone Nargis in 2008, when, nearly 200,000 people lost their lives in a weekend. And the military had done absolutely nothing to prepare the Irrawaddy Delta, even though they'd been in charge of the country's resources for so long. And a group of people got together in the international community and effectively said to the military, if we're going to come in and if we are going to do a wholesale recovery and rescue operation, if we're going to help you get over this massive natural disaster, you are going to have to relinquish power. You're going to have to relinquish not just political power, but your absolute control over the economy. And the military were forced, I think, they realized that they were only going to be able to maintain control of this disaster zone, this disastrous situation, if they were indeed going to allow in the big UN agencies and the international organizations that were going to help the Irrawaddy Delta recover. And we then saw, of course, the 2008 constitution drafted by the military, designed to maintain the military's grip on power. But as part of the deal with the international community, the army was committed or was forced to allow the NLD to stand in various by-elections, the National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, who, to be clear, had very little to do in the very, very early days of the student revolution. She came in by about the July, I think it was, and August of 1988. But the early days of the real student uprising, she wasn't a part of it. She'd come back to Rangoon to look after her mother, who was in the Japanese hospital at the beginning of the year, but really hadn't come out into the open politically until a famous speech she made in the Shui Dagon Pagoda in the late summer of 1988. But essentially, her party, the NLD, emerged through the summer. And by the by-elections of 2012, I think was the first elections, they won handsomely in pretty much all the seats. I think they won in 43 of the 44 seats that they were allowed to stand in. You then had, so there's election in 2010, by-elections, and then the election in 2015, where the NLD won really by a landslide victory. And then you got the real political consolidation by Aung San Suu Kyi. And, she had no choice but to do a deal with the devil if there was going to be some kind of move towards democracy. Then that had to be very carefully managed. And that's what she attempted to do after the 2015 election. One can have a debate about the extent to which she was successful. Of course, she lost many, many friends when she went to The Hague after the upsurge of the genocidal clearance operations by the army in 2017. There were two fact-finding missions mandated by the United Nations Human Rights Council. It gathered a lot of very credible evidence that a genocide had taken place. Aung San Suu Kyi went to The Hague at the International Court of Justice, where the Gambia accused the government, the state of Myanmar, of violating the Genocide Convention. And she went there and she defended the generals. There is a debate about the extent to which she defended the generals, and that I think remains unresolved for many. But certainly, many people in Myanmar felt utterly betrayed by her appearance in The Hague and the way she handled that. Nonetheless, she went back. She fought the election in 2020, won by an even bigger majority. And that, I think, is the thing that really rattled the generals, because I think she had brought in this brilliant Australian economist, Sean Parnell, who I think was looking very sensibly at all sorts of economic reforms that, of course, had to take place if the Myanmar economy was going to survive, it was going to thrive, it was going on to achieve the greatness which, given the country's natural resources, we all know even now that Myanmar is capable of achieving. But that was too much for the generals. And so in the middle of the night before the NLD was going to come to Parliament in Naypyidaw and form a government, the army moved in and arrested the leadership, including Aung San Suu Kyi, of the democratic forces in Myanmar before they could come to Parliament and form a government. Of course, the coup was unconstitutional. Only the president, who of course they arrested, is capable, has the power to dissolve the parliament, declare a state of emergency, do all the things that happened. And the rest is history. I mean, what began as weeks and weeks of peaceful protest was eventually cruelly put down. The lesson of 1988, I think, was writ large. I think the military looked and thought, let's see if we can ride this one out. Let's see where these peaceful protests go. Of course, the army, hatred against the army was so ingrained in Burmese society that there was no way that people were going to let go. And of course, by this stage, Gen Z was in the driving seat. All these incredibly brave and computer savvy kids were always a step ahead of these digital dinosaurs that were the generals. And so for months and months, they were able really to steal a march on the generals. But of course, as the generals realized the extent to which they were losing power, so the number of airstrikes, the number of mass killings, the number of massacres, that all started to increase exponentially. And what you've now seen, I think, is the absolute isolation, with the exception of just a handful of countries on the world stage. Sadly, those include Russia and China, who have vetoes at the Security Council. So we've arrived at a point where, since my involvement in Myanmar in 1987 to today, the military has led the country into utter economic destitution, utter diplomatic isolation, and an utter sense of nihilism, a country devoid of hope, except when you look at what Gen Z is doing in places like Karenni State, to some extent in northern Rakhine State, where they are getting together and they, as part of bottom-up grassroots federal democracy, are delivering health services, delivering education services, looking at the question of accountability, building up the magistrates' courts, trying to professionalise the judiciary. All these things are going on, frankly, behind the back of the diplomatic corps in Rangoon, behind the back of the United Nations, who hardly have really a footprint in the country. They're very much beholden to their contracts with the military government. They're doing what they can to try and loosen the grip that the military have over their operations. But if you talk to the groups in the non-junta areas, they will say that the United Nations is really absent without leave, and they need to be much more present there. But, as I say, Burma, Myanmar would be a country devoid of hope, except when you look at what Gen Z is doing and when you look at the attempts by the young people particularly to build up grassroots democratic institutions, one does have a certain hope for the future. Just as in 1988, when I looked at the bravery of the students, I had a certain hope of what the future might hold for Myanmar.
That's really an excellent rundown, Myanmar 101, since the 88 protests that we're describing, and looking at the trajectory that the country would then and the people would then go on to take. I have another lens I'd like to ask you to look through as we're looking at these passing decades, and that's a lens of media and information, because in 1988, information had to be smuggled out quite literally by phone, by foreign correspondence, by diplomatic pouches, as you say, in order to bring attention both in Burma and outside of Burma as to what's going on. In 2007, things shifted a little bit during the Saffron Revolution, and I guess we could say the following year with with Nargis, that citizens began to push through this blackout. There was some scattered mobile footage, online platforms still very nascent at that time, and still rather difficult to get out, but perhaps slightly easier and more opportunities than 88. But then we go to today, 2021, and the 5 years since the coup. And that's where, even though we have more repression on the side of censorship and surveillance, digital resistance networks were live streaming protests, documenting atrocities in real time, sometimes more effectively even than traditional media. I mean, this stood out for me where there were times in those early months that what was happening in different parts of the country or even different parts of the city were able to be coordinated and understood in ways that, sometimes going back to 88, there could be something that happens not too far from you, just across town, and you don't know about it for months just because of that information blackout. So this was a very different kind of situation post 2021. But with that shift does come the paradox, because those same technologies that are empowering citizen reporting and social media sharing, they're also supercharged with surveillance, disinformation, digital blackouts. And not only that, we're living in a broader, we could say, a post-truth world where, to counter what you said, the truth shall set you free. We're now living in a world where everyone is entitled to their own truth and their own objective truth at that, whatever, despite how mind-bending it could be to try to understand what that means. But, we know that facts are competing with propaganda. Objective reporting can be drowned out by narrative warfare. And so in this environment, this complex environment of changes that have taken place, being someone who's been in the media, in advocacy, played this crucial part at this crucial moment, how do you see the relationship between crisis and journalism evolving, especially in repressive environments like Myanmar is today? And do you think that media can still play a role of trusted witness in a world where both the access and truth are constantly under siege, as we're seeing?
I absolutely do. But just before I get there, can I say that you mentioned the way that the military use social media and can crack down and can have social media blackouts? Can I also say that what we saw in 2016, 2017, 2018 in Rakhine State is also an example of the risks of social media, because the kind of violence that the army was perpetrating against the Rohingya was not, frankly, that different. I mean, it was industrial scale to some extent, but not in the early days. And what turned a vicious military campaign into a genocide was Facebook. Let's be clear about this. And what supercharged Buddhist extremist vicious nationalism was Facebook and the algorithmic tensions and pressures that brought to bear on people. So, yes, it can set people free. It can also make sure that a genocide is committed against them. And one of the things which I think people looking at genocide and that specific genocide have now uncovered is precisely the role of Facebook in supercharging the genocide. So that is, I'm afraid, another of the great risks that social media's development in Myanmar can take. But on your specific question about where I think this can go, I think there is a daily challenge for the revolution, and I see it as a revolution. I think, on the one hand, social media can be used as a way of connecting revolutionary forces across the country. I mean, one of the big problems we've seen emerge really in the last 3 years or so is this lack of coordination. It's partly engendered by the fact that in the ethnic nationalities areas, there is huge distrust of the centre, and the Bama majority, as embodied either by the army or the NLD, is instinctively distrusted. And I think that one of the things social media can do is to give coherence to the very notion of bottom-up federal democracy. And I think that the lessons that are being learned in Karenni state, in the institution building that's going on, thanks to social media, can be learned and is being learned, are being learned in other parts of Myanmar. So that is absolutely a good thing. On the other hand, just as the genocide was turbocharged, so it is possible for the junta to sow the seeds of division by the use of social media. And as you say, everyone somehow in this age is entitled to their own truths, and no one knows that better than the Myanmar junta. So at every stage, by directly combating what the revolutionary movements are doing in the way of using social media, so at every stage, the junta are able to combat them. And that's a very worrying thing. But, I think we have to be honest and say that although there are huge pitfalls, I think that there are great examples of where social media connectivity has been used to the massive advantage of the revolution in order to propagate and to pervade throughout Myanmar ideas of bottom-up federal democracy.
Another aspect is that you've mentioned that the bravery of the Burmese people in '88, that it changed you forever, and that what you witnessed never really leaves. This is when we spoke with Dominic Folder, who was there around the same time. He said something similar, saying that, and this is something not a new or original statement. It's something you hear from many people from many different professions, that it's the one country that can kind of get under your skin. It's something, but as a journalist, it's something that is hard to report on and then walk away from unchanged. And so I'm curious what you think it was about that particular moment or those people, the society in general, that has stayed with you so deeply to this day. Do you think it was something that you witnessed, something someone said, or just the general scale of what was at stake in your involvement in that? And why do you think it is that Burma, more than we could say many other places, and you've certainly traveled and worked for many other countries, what is it about Burma that leaves that kind of imprint in particular?
Well, first of all, in terms of what I took away, the extraordinary foresight of Ne Min, as I say, the grandmaster chess player, who was able, as a 44-year-old human rights lawyer in Rangoon, to see the power of mass media and the way that getting this story, the story of Myanmar and the suffering of individual people, into the national discourse. And I think that was one of the key lessons, that I think the suffering of Myanmar, the people of Myanmar, in a way had been unique because it had been so forgotten. Myanmar was so non-aligned, it actually left the non-aligned movement. It was so much an information black hole that people, certainly in the West, had really forgotten about it. And it was this sense of a people that had been in the dark ages for so long, suddenly waking up and the light of truth shining across the country and just awakening a national spirit that had lain dormant. That was, I think, something which was quite unique to Myanmar. And I think one of the other really important things is this sense of the indomitability of the people of Myanmar. There is this real courage. I mean, I actually have to say I've also worked in Gaza in subsequent years. In 2007, became the director of communications, a director of communications for the United Nations in the Middle East. And again, of course, there are many, many differences between Gaza and Myanmar. But one of the things which, again, I take away from Gaza is this indomitability, that no matter how vicious and brutal the sort of genocidal Zionist forces are against the largely unprotected, unarmed population in Gaza, people will always stand up for their beliefs, their religious beliefs in some cases, their deep-seated belief in who they are as people and their rights to self-determination, both as individuals and as communities. And I think, as I say, there are some aspects of Myanmar which are very distinctive. something very historical about the way that Burma was in the world. But I think there are also some things, similarities that I could see, which are cross-cutting amongst oppressed people. I also worked in Bosnia during the genocide in Bosnia. And there is this sense, this sort of post-colonial sense, or in the case of Bosnia, this sort of post-Titoite sense of a nation and a people waiting to achieve their full sense of self-determination. And I think in the case of both the Palestinians and in the case of the people of Myanmar, that is an as yet unfulfilled aspiration. But when you come into contact with these people at these particular historical junctions, either as a UN official, as I was in Gaza, or as a BBC reporter, you are left in absolutely no doubt that at some stage, because of the indomitability of these people, both as individuals and as a people as a whole, they will attain that aspiration. It's simply a question of when and how that happens.
And I now want to move the story along from as we're talking about what's happening in Myanmar to what's been happening with you. And actually, this still relates to Myanmar because you now lead the Myanmar Accountability Project, MAP, which works to bring Myanmar's military leaders to justice through legal mechanisms like universal jurisdiction. And so rather than documenting events for the public, you're now building legal cases. You're targeting individual perpetrators of torture, rape, and other crimes, often in courts very far from Myanmar itself. And so for you, that represents a real significant shift from reporting events to actively pursuing accountability for them. So I'm curious to know what drove that transition for you. And after decades as a journalist, what made you feel that storytelling wasn't enough and you wanted to start moving towards naming names and going to court and being involved, in this case with Myanmar, in a different way?
So, as a journalist, you report on facts, and sometimes, as I did in 1988, you find yourselves reporting on facts that appear to have a huge historical significance for a particular country, as was the case of the 1980 events for Myanmar. But where did it lead? It led to a situation where today the military is still in charge, one of the most brutal dictatorships in the world. I would obviously give information to Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and others. But again, what would happen to that information? There would be an Amnesty report, there would be a press release, it would go to the BBC, VOA, wherever, and it would be a headline for a day, and then it would vanish. And when the coup happened in February 2021, although we all knew it was going to happen, because frankly, General Min Aung Hlaing said it was going to happen, there was a sense of like, oh my God, what are we going to do now? So all the development people going, oh God, what should we do about developments? And all the emergency assistance people saying, what should we do about emergency assistance? And all the human rights crowd were doing, and what didn't exist was an organization exclusively given over to criminal litigations against those committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, since the coup. So there were organizations documenting the Rohingya genocide and trying to bring cases, but there was nobody working specifically and exclusively on crimes committed by the junta since the coup. And I got together with a bunch of very clever lawyers. Full disclosure, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal scholar, I don't have a legal background. And we started to look at where it would be possible to bring cases against the junta. And one of the first places which it soon became apparent was going to be a good jurisdiction was Turkey. Now, Turkey to the outside world has a reputation for being a place where the Erdogan regime sort of tortures Kurds and, beats up the opposition, has a terrible human rights record. But the penal code allows universal jurisdiction. So let me just explain. Universal jurisdiction is the idea that some crimes are so grave that it doesn't matter where they're committed, it doesn't matter what nationality the perpetrators are or what nationality the victims are, that certain states, that arguably all states, have an obligation to go after the perpetrators of certain crimes. So a good example is UNCAT, the United Nations Convention Against Torture. If a government signs that, it arguably has an obligation to move against torturers and torture wherever it happens, not just in their own jurisdiction, but anywhere. And it doesn't matter whether the victims of that torture are their own nationalities or not. There is a universal obligation because they are a signatory to the United Nations Convention Against Torture, which is, in the case of many governments around the world, enacted into their national legislation through a vote of their national parliaments. So if you look at the penal codes of many of the 195 member states of the United Nations, some of them have specific legislation that say torture must never happen. You can hear trials against torturers in this country, and it doesn't matter. So Turkey not only has in its penal code an injunction against crimes against humanity and war crimes, it also allows trials in absentia. So I decided that we would have a go at Turkey. And MAP, my organisation, the Myanmar Accountability Project, does not have an investigations department. We're a very, very small organisation. We have funding for 3 years. I hasten to add, I work entirely pro bono. And I found the most astonishing lawyer in Istanbul who has a history of doing universal jurisdiction cases. I worked with an organisation. We found a victim of a torture victim, and we found various other victims, and we interviewed them. We got their evidence from them, and with our lawyer in Turkey, a remarkable lawyer called Gulden Somnes, she'd actually been on the Gaza flotilla many years ago, which was interdicted by the Israeli army, not the recent ones, the Israeli Navy, in which they killed eventually 10 Turkish peace activists, humanitarian activists. And Gulden helped us bring a case in Istanbul in 2022. Much to my surprise, after we presented the evidence, the government, the Ministry of Justice said, right, we're going to open an investigation. And suddenly we thought, wow, we've got an open investigation in Turkey. And the way that it works is that we can turn up and submit fresh evidence. Now, one important thing to say straight up about the work of MAP is that we put victims and victims' voices front and center. So wherever we go to a place, we make sure that the voices of the victims are reflected in anything we do, so that whatever happens the case, if the case collapses tomorrow morning, the story of Myanmar, of torture in Myanmar, would be told. So we went back actually recently to Istanbul, and we filed evidence about the Paziji massacre. The Paziji massacre took place in April 2023. At least 157 victims, documented cases, were killed when two 500-pound bombs were dropped on the village. That was in the early morning. Then later in the afternoon, as first responders were going in to recover bodies, do rescue operations, the junta then came back with helicopter gunships and tried to kill them. There were then attacks on aid workers. So the National Unity Government, their human rights department, has done a really good investigation of the Paziji massacre. So on a trip to Turkey just a few weeks ago, I went with a man called Tunong Shui, a brilliant representative of the National Unity Government, and he spoke out. He presented the case to the Turkish media, to the international media, to various human rights groups and lawyers associations that were in Istanbul. So around all of our cases, and this is an example of the case in Turkey, we absolutely make it vitally part of the case that the voices of the victims are very much told, and the truths of the victims are validated, as are their narratives. And one of the great things about the work we do is we see victims make that extraordinary transformation, this transformative journey from being victims of atrocity crimes to survivors of atrocity crimes to being advocates for themselves and their own communities. And that's very much what MAP is about. It's about empowering the people of Myanmar. As I say, you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. It's about giving them the truth and allowing that truth to have a transformative power. And it's extraordinary when you talk to victims. these are people who never thought they would have access to justice. And they say, we can now begin our grief. We can now begin to get over this hugely traumatic event because we've stood up in front of the world media and we've told the stories of our families being butchered and their bodies being mutilated, all these terrible things that have been happening. And they say that is a very important journey that we've been on. And that's what happens when you see universal jurisdiction from the perspective of the victims, as opposed to high up. I mean, people sometimes say to me, well, when are you ever going to get Min Aung Hlaing convicted? And many of the victims say, we don't necessarily want Min Aung Hlaing to go to The Hague. If he goes to The Hague, he'll have a really nice cell, he'll have medical visits, he'll have good food, he'll probably even have conjugal visits. Whereas we were in a sort of cell with 100 people, we saw our friends and family members die of COVID. For them, justice and accountability, in very large part, is about them being able to tell their stories. So that's our case in Turkey. We also have a case in the Philippines, because the Philippines is an avowedly Christian country, thanks to Spanish colonialism. We took a delegation, a group of victims from Chin State. As you know, the Chin people are avowedly Christian, so there was a natural sympathy in Manila for our case. We flew victims from Australia, from Canada, from the UK, from India to Manila. The penal code in Manila, in the Philippines, is very clear that the victims have to come and present their evidence in person. So we had to work with victims who weren't in there, who we could get out to the Philippines. We presented our case. We've had to go to appeal there because there's a whole load of political maneuverings because Duterte, the former President Duterte, withdrew the Philippines from the International Court of Justice. There's great nervousness about international justice in the Philippines, but things are changing. I think the agreement between Marcos Jr. and Duterte has clearly fallen to pieces, and so we're hoping that the Marcos administration will allow our case to come to trial, but we've had to go to appeal in order to try and make that happen. So that's where we are in the Philippines. We also have a case in Indonesia where we petitioned the Constitutional Court. As you probably know, after the massacres in East Timor, the Indonesian government under President Habibie set up a human rights court because the UN Security Council was threatening to send its own fact-finding mission, its own investigators to investigate Indonesian generals. And Habibie said, no, we'll set up. We're perfectly good at dealing with our own generals and our own misdemeanors, so we'll set up a court to do it. And the Human Rights Court in Jakarta, will only allow cases against Indonesian nationals to be heard. And we petitioned the Constitutional Court, arguing that the law which set up the Human Rights Court was unconstitutional because the Indonesian constitution is very much a post-Second World War document which talks about the universality of human rights. And we argued that if you're going to argue that human rights are universal, as the Constitution does, then you cannot restrict cases in the Human Rights Court to Indonesian nationals. And we petitioned the Indonesian court, and in the upsumming, they agreed with pretty much all of our arguments. And we thought, great, we're going to win this one. We'll be able to bring a Myanmar case in this court. And then at the very end, the president of the court said, and we throw out your petition in its entirety. So we are now going back to Indonesia under the new penal code, which comes into force next year. Universal jurisdiction cases are allowed. So at some stage, I'm not entirely sure when, we will be going back to Indonesia to ask them to allow a universal jurisdiction case. I don't want to say too much about that because it's very much being planned. And if I give too much away, I think it will probably undermine our case. And then very finally, we have a case in Timor-Leste, in East Timor. Again, an avowedly Christian country, thanks to Portuguese colonialism. And we will be working with the Chin Human Rights Organization, CHRO, an absolutely brilliant organization, to bring a case in Dili in the new year. So that's what we're doing in terms of universal jurisdiction. As I say, it's a long process. It's a way of using information in a way that produces results for the victims and it's a way that allows victims to step forward and to tell their truths and to validate their narratives. And for me, that is the ultimate value of this universal jurisdiction work.
That's an awesome rundown that you provide of all of this work you're doing with universal jurisdiction and these, and it's just a very creative approach across the globe, really, in many different countries and many different contexts. I do want to ask a question that might that's coming a bit from the side of the devil's advocate, just to sharpen and some of the focus and relief of your understanding and rationale as to why you're engaging in this route. And that's that, MAP's work is grounded in this belief that international law, and especially this concept of universal jurisdiction, that it can offer some measure of justice where the domestic systems in Myanmar have failed. But, just as we mentioned, the time that we're living in, this post-truth era and one of digital surveillance and repression, we're also living at a time where the very foundations of international law, multilateral order, seem to be increasingly fragile. We have permanent members of the UN Security Council that are flouting human rights violations with impunity. Global enforcement mechanisms are slow, politicized, or toothless. Given this backdrop, and I should mention as well that that in your answer, I'm also I'm aware of how it's not only victim centered and having victim voices and being and leading the way, but you've also talked to victims that feel just the mere process of having their voice out there and making this public, that to them some of that might in and of itself be a win. So we might be looking at kind of different goalposts or different objectives as to what really constitutes the final goal of what we're trying to accomplish here. So that has to be mentioned as well. But given this backdrop of the way that the global order finds itself today, how would you respond to those who might see some of your work as principled and wonderful, but ultimately perhaps idealistic in this kind of environment we're now operating? And what would give you the confidence, and which obviously you have, because this is a mission and a pathway that you're pursuing, that pursuing these legal pathways, they still matter, especially in a time and in a context where these global norms themselves are just feeling so under strain everywhere?
That's a really, really important question, and I'm really glad you've asked it. And I don't see it as a devil's advocate question at all. I think it's a really important question to address, and it's very much part of the thinking behind MAP. If you look at what's happened since the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you look at Gaza, what you had in the case of Ukraine was pretty much days after the full-scale invasion, you had ICC arrest warrants out for Putin. You had 20 jurisdictions which didn't even have penal codes that allowed for universal jurisdiction, announcing special tribunals to go after Russian war criminals and Putin. Contrast Gaza, where as soon as Karim Khan, the prosecutor at the ICC, announced arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and his then defense minister, Yoav Gallant, you got Trump sanctioning the court, and you got Trump sanctioning Karim Khan and some of the judges. You saw these extraordinary political attacks, complete weaponization, politicization of these international justice mechanisms. You also saw, by the way, the ICC, Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor I just mentioned, who I think is a very principled man, by the way. I mean, he constantly talks of the court operating without fear or favor. He then he went to the pre-trial chamber. So the way an arrest warrant works is the prosecutor has to go to one of two pre-trial chambers and say, I want this arrest warrant issued, will you do it? And they then have to assess the case and see whether there's a case to go to trial, which is why it's called the pre-trial chamber. And then what happened is all the political confusion around the court suddenly erupted. So we're still waiting for the ICC, pre-trial chamber 1, to make a decision on whether it decides to arrest or issue arrest warrants for Min Aung Hlaing. My sense is that it might well do, but we have to wait and see. So I'm not saying that the ICC process is just, or that it's fair. It's highly politicized, But it's what we've got, folks. I'm sorry, it's a lever that's there, and I think we have no choice but to pull it, and to pull it very hard. And in the case of Myanmar, you've got this thing called the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, which is a bunch of absolutely brilliant investigators after the Rohingya fact-finding missions in 2018, 2019. Their information was then deposited with this organization, which is headquartered in Geneva, and they have the most extraordinary evidence, which they're giving to the ICC, which is actually being used in the case. They're also giving evidence to the case in Argentina, where, by the way, arrest warrants for 23 members of the military civilian government, including Aung San Suu Kyi and Min Aung Hlaing, have been issued. So, yes, one can be cynical about these international justice mechanisms, but there are arrest warrants that have been put out by the court in Buenos Aires. You've also got the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. So the ICC I mentioned goes after individuals, so people like Netanyahu, Min Aung Hlaing, and other dictators like Putin. The ICJ adjudicates disputes between states. So at the ICJ, the Gambia has accused Myanmar as a state of violating the Genocide Convention. The court has been incredibly slow. My goodness, I mean, no one's more cynical about the ICJ than I am. They have issued what they call provisional measures, which effectively is the court saying, we believe a genocide is going on against the Rohingya, and we demand that the potentially genocidal state needs to take the following measures. It's painfully slow. Meanwhile, the genocide against the Rohingya continues, and in fact, we presented evidence about the continuation of the genocide in our recent case in Turkey. But the fact is, it's another one of those levers that's there. It's very slow. International justice wheels turn very slowly, but they do turn. Let me give you an example. I was a UN official, a very minor UN official in the mid-90s in the Balkans, in Bosnia. I was actually the UN spokesman in July 1995 during the Srebrenica massacre, in which 9,000 Bosnian Muslims were taken away by the Bosnian Serb army, Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic, and they were taken to a football stadium and gunned down and were buried in a mass grave. Now, at the time, we were all absolutely appalled, and we just said, we bow our head in shame. Here we are, the UN that's meant to be protecting these people, and a genocidal massacre has just taken place, and it was terrible. Cut to decades later, Serbia wants to join the EU. There are all these fugitive war criminals, which the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, which was established, has investigated. And the EU say to Serbia, you want to join the EU? Well, the price you pay for joining the EU is you hand over Slobodan Milosevic. He was handed over. And there is a brilliant book by my friend Julian Borgia of The Guardian called On the Butcher's Trail. And what Julian's book chronicles is the fact that pretty much every single war criminal on the list of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia either got shot in arrest, committed suicide, was taken to The Hague and found guilty, or had a heart attack in The Hague. They were pretty much all got in one form or another. So, yes, I think it's absolutely proper that people are cynical and they question these international justice mechanisms. Yes, I think it's absolutely fair to say they are deeply flawed, they are deeply politicized. Would you give up on an international criminal tribunal that saw pretty much all of the war criminals in the Balkans brought to justice in some form or another? No, of course not. Are you allowed to be cynical now? Yes. Are there many, many victims of the genocide in Rakhine State who it's too late for? They've been murdered in their tens of thousands. It's too late for them. It's criminal. It's appalling. And I'm making no attempt to defend the justice system that's seen tens of thousands of people killed in the way that they have been in this 21st century genocide. But what I would say is that accountability mechanisms, both at the level of international justice mechanisms, the ICJ and the ICC, they are a system we've got. They are a way of promoting some form of accountability, and we have no choice but to use them imperfect as they are. And I think at my level, far lower down the food chain of the level of MAP and the universal jurisdiction work we do, again, I have absolute belief in MAP's mission that the pursuing of universal jurisdiction cases allows victims to tell their stories. It highlights in the international and local media the work that we're doing. And another really important aspect, for example, of the case in Turkey, we were working with an investigative group in northern Rakhine State. For reasons of security, I can't say who they are, but it's a group of young investigators who've been investigating abuses. There was an attack on a village in northern Rakhine State in January 2024. This group went out there, they gathered extraordinary evidence of these abuses, they gave it to MAP, we took it to our lawyers in Istanbul, we filed the evidence, and then we did a load of media in Burmese as well as Turkish, by the way, because we wanted to influence Turkish audiences, the political echelons in Turkey, but also in English. And so this group that were having a genocide committed against them heard the evidence being gathered at the grassroots, being fed into an international case in Turkey, and they heard it all coming back in the Burmese media. Tulong Shui gave a great interview, for example, to the BBC Burmese service in which he talked about this. So it also empowers grassroots doing extraordinary work. And by the way, those groups in northern Rakhine State see themselves as part of the emerging system of grassroots federal democracy, that they are working on accountability as part of justice mechanisms, which hopefully will be part of the political order moving forward inside Myanmar. So there are many reasons to be cynical, but there are even more reasons to be absolutely bold and brave and robust in pursuing the accountability agenda.
I want to go back to one thread in your answer that you hit upon. That's the United Nations. And you have been, and you're not alone in this, have been publicly critical of the United Nations role in Myanmar, especially the decision to cooperate with the junta on refugee repatriation, which you've called appalling and dangerous. And you've also warned that moves like removing the UN markings from vehicles risk compromising neutrality and also will serve to embolden the regime that's it's been credibly accused of genocide. So given these concerns and probably many others that we could launch, and again, with the disclaimer that the United Nations is not monolith. There are different departments, agencies, individuals. Individuals matter. The particular personality and individual you have in a role matters tremendously, despite whatever the mission of that agency is, what one person is willing to do. But what do you believe the UN should be doing differently in Myanmar? And do you see it as a problem of political will or structural failure or something deeper that and what would meaningful accountability, because you are the Myanmar Accountability Project, so what would meaningful accountability look like from an institution that does continue to engage with the perpetrators?
Well, first of all, I'm old enough to see the history and the institutional patterns of abuse here. After the spike in the Rohingya genocide in 2017, the Secretary General commissioned a report by one of the Latin American ambassadors in New York into why it was that the UN was a silent witness to genocide. Effectively, there was a huge UN presence throughout the Rohingya genocide, and yet nothing was done. People didn't really speak out. As I say, the UN was a silent witness to genocide. And what the report effectively said is there was no joined up thinking. There was the Security Council held hostage to a Russian and Chinese veto. There was the General Assembly, which was all over the place. In the Security Council, Britain, as the penholder, the former colonial power, was trying to do all sorts of stuff. Eventually, they got through Resolution 2669, the first and only resolution of the Security Council in the history of the United Nations. You had the resident coordinator. For many years, there was no resident coordinator. They saw it fit not even to appoint one. You had the UN country team, which was very much based in Yangon, in their own compounds. They didn't get out into the areas which were non-junta controlled. They need to get visas from the junta. Except OHCHR, by the way, the Human Rights Office decided that it was going to go and not, work with the junta. They weren't allowed to have visas, so they're working in neighbouring countries and elsewhere. And I think they do a very creditable job at documenting the abuses. So the report highlighted this disparate, badly coordinated group of bodies responsible for different things. And the Secretary General at the time issued a statement through his spokesman and said, I accept every single one of these recommendations to join up the operation of the United Nations. And yet those recommendations have never really been implemented all these years later. So cut to today, and we have the earthquake early in the year, and the junta has weaponized the UN's aid. There is an attempt by the UN to work through local partners. Much, much more has to happen. The UN is not getting involved, in my view, sufficiently with cross-border aid. There is some happening through Thailand, but what about Bangladesh? What about India? That's a trick which, in my view, is being missed. And I think that although the Volker Turk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, has been absolutely brilliant in speaking out, I think his reports and his language, I think Tom Andrews, the rapporteur for human rights, I think he has been very good indeed. But I think on the ground, what we're not seeing is the country team really taking the kind of steps that need to be taken, being much more bold with the junta, really trying to push the envelope with the junta. They are far too beholden, I think, to the junta, and that's alienated an awful lot of people in Myanmar from the junta. And I remain a critic. I love the UN. I think some of the work they do is extraordinary. I mean, I was listening to a podcast today by Vicky Bowman, the former British ambassador in Yangon, who started an organisation that tries to inculcate into Myanmar good business practice. And at one point she said, and we were working with UNDP on this. And I thought, wow, that's something really great that UNDP has done. So I think there are good things that are being done in the UN system. It's just that the sum of what we see is just not credible. And it's just not credible in the eyes of the people of Myanmar. And I think that's one reason why the response plan, the UN's response plan, I don't have the very latest figure in front of me, but it's woefully underfunded. And I think that's because, apart from the global financial issues around foreign aid and what we've seen under Trump, I think in any case, there's been a massive collapse of confidence in the United Nations humanitarian work on the ground in Myanmar.
Right. So that's a detailed and nuanced accounting of the various aspects of the United Nations work in Myanmar. I'd like to return to some of the work that you're doing with MAP, because as you know, we recently talked to your colleague Damian Lilly, who joined our program and talked about his background as well as his role at the Myanmar Accountability Project. And in that conversation, he referenced how even if legal efforts at MAP are not yielding prosecutions overnight, they can, quote, change calculations. In other words, simply knowing that someone is building a case against you can alter behavior at the top. This is the possibility and the presumption, of course, to what degree those on the side of the Myanmar military who have already chosen their path are caring much about what us on the other side of those tracks are doing is open to question. But I'm wondering if you see that happening. Do you feel that MAP's work has shifted how junta figures are acting or how the international system interacts with them? And more broadly, what's your take on the role of virtue signaling versus actual enforcement in building long-term accountability?
Well, first of all, because the Myanmar junta is pretty much the most secretive junta on the planet, it's pretty much impossible to say what motivates them. So I would be an idiot if I got on your podcast and started making claims about MAP's accountability work, making the junta feel they're being watched, altering their behaviour. There's plenty of evidence that it's having no effect whatsoever on their behaviour. The National Unity Government, when we did this case with them in Turkey, they have documented 413 massacres, and they classify a massacre as a single deliberate mass killing in which there are more than 5 victims. So On the other hand, there's no cold in this experiment. This isn't to say that, perhaps if MAP didn't exist and other groups doing accountability, OHCHR have done amazing documentation work, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, it isn't to say that things wouldn't be a lot worse. There's no doubt that there is a morale issue in the Myanmar military, that we are seeing increasing numbers of defections. There is evidence anecdotally at the local level that commanders and people lower down in the army who see their seniors having these cases brought against them are feeling despondent. And I think that there is anecdotal, and it's really only anecdotal evidence, that accountability work is having some effect on morale in the army. The other aspect of this, which I wanted to mention, is the fact that if you're a Burmese person, a Myanmar citizen, and you're living in, I don't know, northern Rakhine State, you feel very, very abandoned. And actually hearing that there are organizations doing investigations in your vicinity and that this information is being fed into efforts to bring the perpetrators to account, I think it does have some effect. And I do think it sends a signal to people inside Myanmar that they're not being abandoned. And I think the other aspect, or another aspect of our work, is that there is a huge battle, diplomatic battle, going on at the Credentials Committee at the United Nations General Assembly. It's a rather arcane and obscure diplomatic game that's played, but basically where you have administrations, so-called, competing for credentials at the UN. In the UN General Assembly, there are, I think, 4 seats per delegation. And what happens in terms of the bureaucracy is that a government will send a letter to the Secretary General, which also goes to the President of the General Assembly, saying, we are the representative of the nation, of the state of Myanmar, and we want to be credentialed. Here are the names of our representatives. But classically, after either a coup or a disputed election, you can get a disputed credentials claim where 2 or more organizations or groups claiming to represent the state make an application for credentials. And what happened is, after the coup in Myanmar, you had the junta applying to the Credentials Committee, which meets at the beginning of the General Assembly in September, demanding that it is credentialed, and the National Unity Government saying, no, Jomotun, Ambassador Jomotun, is our ambassador, and we want him to be there. So there's then a debate in the 9-member Credentials Committee. The United States, Russia, and China are permanent members on this committee without veto power, like they have in the General Assembly, by the way. And the other 6 members rotate every year. Now, while there are in the air, in the discourse, in the international media, all this noise about genocide cases being brought in Turkey and the junta being accused of massacres in places like the Philippines and in East Asia. We also have a case, by the way, in London, but that's another story. It's not a UJ case. It kind of adds to the mood music around this junta that it's illegitimate. And one of the criteria for assessing who should be credentialed at the United Nations is the ability of the administration applying for that to protect the human rights of its population. And indeed, the democratic credentials are also a criterion that's used in order to assess the suitability of any administration to be credentialed. So, these cases do add to this sense of war criminals on the run, illegitimate thugs who have no right to sit in the civilized community of nations. So, there are many different ways which are sort of intangible. As I say, we did a lot of work around the Credentials Committee, a lot of advocacy. Damien Lilly was actually involved in some of that in those days. And I'm not saying that it's because of MAP's private and public advocacy around this case, but we had to, we commissioned a legal opinion about this. We got one of the great jurisprudential scholars, Ralph Wild of University College London, to do this very learned paper, which we distributed. So, it all adds up, and it's water dripping on a stone. I'm making no claims about the efficacy of universal jurisdiction. Yes, it's true that we've not managed to bang Min on Lime up in some prison in some jurisdiction in the world. but we have certainly increased this sense that he is a war criminal on the run, that he heads an administration which is a bunch of gangsters and kleptocratic thugs, and that these are not the people deserving of being credentialed amongst the community of nations. And at the same time, I would say that we are giving the people of Myanmar a sense that the world has not forgotten them. It's another lever that can be pulled, and we're giving victims a chance to allow their voices to be heard.
I want to bring up another question that Damien Lilly raised when we were having our conversation, and that's that inside many systems, there's this question that's wrestled with, and this is going back to your UN answer as well as when you're looking at questions of legitimacy, as well as when you're looking at questions of kind of bringing everyone at the table, and there are these kind of differing motivations depending on the organization that's engaging to, wanting to put at the forefront questions of legitimacy and what signaling towards legitimacy is indicating, and then questions of dialogue and conversation and what it means to be at least having some level or measure of talking with some of the parties, no matter how much you may vehemently disagree with what they represent and what they're actually doing. And so this question that we discussed, that we talked about when Damien Lilly was on, was at what point does engagement with a military regime turn to complicity? Given your criticisms of the UN's posture towards the junta, do you have a sense of where this line gets crossed? And of course, the UN's not the only culpable party here. There are other ways of international engagement we can look at that question can be posed to as well. And do you think that there's a form of principled engagement that can take place? What would that look like? Or is it even possible in this current climate?
Well, I think there's some very obvious examples of where the UN's engagement has been used by the junta, and whether I go as far as saying it's complicity. I mean, that's a very big thing to say against the complicity in a war crime. I mean, I don't think the UN is complicit in the industrial scale murder of Rohingyas. I think their silence on it has been absolutely appalling. At every level except Volker Turk, I would say. I think that when you get the head of UNICEF newly arrived in the country, swanning off to Naypyidaw and having photographs with junta officials in this sort of Pyongyang-style La La Land illegitimate government stronghold, so embattled at a time when we know from the number of townships that the government's going to hold or claiming to hold this fake election in, shows how little grip they have, how little effective control they have of the party. I think it's clear that those high-profile media events that the UN gets sucked into are clearly wrong. And I think you say, where does the line get crossed? A line gets crossed when a new head of a UN organization goes off to Naypyidaw and says, I'm going to shake hands with these people who are responsible for, if you look at the latest figures, it's about 5 or 6 million children are in desperate need of protection in Myanmar. And you get, the head of UNICEF swanning off to Naypyidaw and being seen by this population whose children are so abused in so many different ways, shaking hands with these people. That's clearly an egregious crossing of a line. So I think there are many examples looking back on where the UN has shown itself to cross that line. Another one is something you referred to in a question you asked me earlier, where the UN facilitated a trip on the Naf River to the refugee camps in Bangladesh by junta officials, and they took the UN insignia off their boats, and they allowed the junta to travel in these boats. I mean, that was so obviously a violation of UN neutrality, the humanitarian principles. That was a clear line being crossed. As far as the UN is concerned, I think it's very obvious where they've made mistakes, and they need to be far more intelligent and far more nuanced about the way that they engage with the junta in a way that doesn't destroy their credibility with the people of Myanmar. And that's just, I think, a question of being sensible. And they so clearly have not been bound by these very obvious ways of conducting yourself inside the country. I think also, when it comes to governments engaging, you've had these various attempts at ceasefires. You've had the 10th anniversary of the NCA recently, in which Min Aung Hlaing, was seen to be was in charge of this legitimate ceasefire process. But again, I mean, a lot of people look at this process and say that those who are behind this peacemaking process are legitimizing an illegitimate junta. That is not to say that contacts must be maintained on all sides. I mean, I have worked with the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue, an absolutely brilliant Geneva-based organisation that goes around the world and has, in quite a few cases, prevented conflicts, has solved conflicts, has been responsible for peace agreements behind the scenes that have saved the lives of millions, of countless people. And they've done that by quietly maintaining contacts with some really bad people, groups considered to be terrorist organizations, groups that have committed genocide and done terrible things. But they do it in an intelligent way. They do it in a way that's quiet and behind the scenes. So I'm not saying that there must be zero contact with the junta. I think that contact with the junta should be absolutely minimized. I think that they should be they should be sanctioned for the crimes they've committed. I think they should be isolated wherever possible. But I think that at a certain time, it's in order to get rid of the army, it's going to be necessary at some stage to talk to the army. It's not for me as an outsider to say how those contacts are maintained, who they're maintained with. But I think that now is not the right time to be maintaining high-level contacts with the Myanmar junta. What they're trying to do is legitimize an entirely illegitimate fake election. And anyone who has contacts with the regime at the moment is going to be used in that process of them trying to legitimize their totally illegitimate rule. But what I'm saying is, I don't know, maybe in 100 years' time, maybe in 50 years' time, goodness knows when the Myanmar army will decide to withdraw from politics. But at that point, and I hope it happens sooner rather than later, it is going to be necessary for the victorious revolutionary democratic forces to have some kind of conversation with this institution, which has brutalized their country for so long, but which has been in control of many of the levers of state, and which has been in control of the economy. So, I suppose what I'm saying is that the UN has got it largely wrong. I think many in the international community, in sort of senior level engagement with the junta, have got it wrong. I think that there is some role at the appropriate time, and that appropriate time is not now, to maintain discreet contacts with all sides in a conflict so that come the day when peace is possible, those contacts bear fruit. But right now, I think there has to be complete isolation of the junta, and I think in any case it has to be the revolutionary forces within Myanmar and not an outsider, a foreigner like me, that decides when that moment has come. But certainly, as I say, for the time being, I think we have to wait and see how things change on the battlefield. Things are going in all sorts of directions, but I think that now is not the time to be talking to the junta.
So as we're talking about the universal jurisdiction that you're overseeing as part of the Myanmar Accountability Project, and you've listed any number of countries around the world impressively that you're taking up these UJ avenues and pathways, there is one very curious and interesting exception that's unique in its own right, and that's right at home in the UK. So can you tell us about what it is you're doing in the UK to continue with MAPS projects that stands out as distinct and different from some of the other projects you have around the world?
Sure. So the case in London is really interesting. As you say, quite rightly, it's not a universal jurisdiction case. After the coup in February 2021, the representatives of the coup in London threw the ambassador out of the residence. Sorry, threw the ambassador out of the embassy because he, for the eyes of many rather belatedly, but certainly after a few days, came out, held up the three fingers in support of the civil disobedience movement. And so the junta representatives locked him out of the embassy. And they then tried to get their hands on the ambassadorial residence, which is a £6-7 million property in the leafy North London suburb of Hampstead. And by sheer chance, the lawyers who I set up MAP with were the lawyers that the ambassador, Josua Min, went to give him pro bono legal services. I don't think they've all been entirely pro bono, but the fact is that the lawyers then said to him, you need to talk to Chris Gunness about doing some public advocacy. So what we did is we turned what was effectively a diplomatic dispute around the Vienna Diplomatic Convention, which governs the behaviour of governments towards diplomats and the diplomatic niceties and protocols and frameworks between states. And we sent a letter to the junta. We said to them, this is not a diplomatic dispute. This is a property dispute. And if you think someone is trespassing in your property in Britain, you go to a magistrate and you obtain what's called an eviction notice. You then go to the police and you say, excuse me, someone's trespassing in my property. Will you please go and evict them? And of course, we said, you've got to get that from a magistrate, not from the police. And we explained to them politely that a magistrate will not issue an eviction notice because this is really way above a magistrate's head. We said to them, this will get escalated to the High Court. If something goes to the High Court and you lose, you will face huge costs. So just let the matter drop. And for quite a few years, the matter was just left dormant. Cut to about 6 months ago, the junta went to the Metropolitan Police again and said, we want to bring a case. To my amazement, Lord Hermer, who is the Labour Attorney General, who can either prevent or allow a case to go to court, he actually gave the junta the green light for taking a case through the UK courts to have the ambassador who has opposed the military junta thrown out of the house. And the case went to Westminster Magistrates Court a couple of months ago, and it's now coming back to the courts in January. And we now face the prospect of a magistrate saying to Josua Min, you are trespassing, you must leave, and this house must now be handed over to the junta. And at a time when the news in Britain is the government has just intervened to prevent a China espionage going to court. So the government's just blocked a case against China, but which is allowing a case by the Myanmar junta. That is astonishing. So, watch this space. So MAP has been very active in supporting this case against the junta getting hold of Myanmar House, the ambassadorial residence in London. It's going to go to court. And it may be, not definitely, it may get postponed again. Who knows what might happen? But a Labour Attorney General who claims to espouse the international rule of law is allowing a junta which the British government has sanctioned, the British government has condemned their coup in multiple fora. The British government has done all these things, is allowing these thugs, these people who've stolen the Burmese economy from the Burmese people, now to have a chance to steal the ambassadorial residence, which belongs to the people of the Union of Myanmar. It's just astonishing. And I pray that either Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, will come to his senses and stop the case going forward before it actually comes to court in January, or if it does, the magistrate who will adjudicate on this case will see that there is absolutely no case for the Burmese junta to be given Myanmar House. But, as I say, let's talk again in January to see what happens. But for the time being, the jury's out. So, let's hope and let's pray. As I say, it's a non-UJ case, but it's a very interesting case that MAP has been working on.
So thank you for adding that piece on, and I think that the recent case you discuss, as well as the whole host of other issues you're working on, I think it also just displays how this so much of the work that we're seeing that is being done to try to on the part of the resistance, whether it's through denying legitimacy or through accountability or any number of measures that we haven't talked about on this episode that many other guests have spoken. So much of it involves, individual people with individual motivations and ethics that are doing what they can so that these things are not just let go and are picked up and are attended to and are responded to. So I think that so much of this conversation, going from those early days in the mid 80s through 88 and then through more recent times with the work with Myanmar Accountability Project, so much of that is indicating those decisions that you've taken with your agency to be able to bring out truth and advocacy and information in the Myanmar space. So I thank you for sharing that story, talking about these last number of decades as well as the recent work.
Well, thank you, first of all, so much for giving me the opportunity. The 2 hours seems to have gone past very, very quickly, and I'm really grateful and honoured to be on your podcast and to have this chance. I suppose my final reflection would be to say that although I think the work of individuals is important, I think ultimately when justice comes and when justice, which is very much a part of a free and stable and prosperous Burma, the credit will really go to the people through the decades who have given their lives and have so selflessly demonstrated time and time again in Burma, in Myanmar, the indomitability and the uniqueness of the Burmese spirit. And I think that's the ultimate thought to leave people on, that it's the indomitability of the Burmese spirit that ultimately will see this nation transformed.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Insight Myanmar Podcast. This platform is more than just a series of conversations. It's a reflection of deeply held values that guide everything we do. From raising awareness about Myanmar's challenges to amplifying voices of resilience, from sharing unfiltered truths to fostering empathy and connection, we're dedicated to creating something meaningful and impactful. We strive to bring on guests who can educate listeners about Myanmar's rich culture and complex history, while also providing space for spiritual and mindful practices that nurture resilience. Above all, we aim to build bridges, connecting people across the globe to the stories, struggles, and triumphs of those in or related to Myanmar. If these values resonate with you, we invite you to help sustain this work. By contributing, you're directly supporting a platform that prioritizes human connection, truth, and meaningful action in a time when these are needed most. Visit insightmyanmar.org/donation to help us today.
Ora bayara nangkaya unya nada do ya dalam biar digane zat mana we kada besaya na besaya Oba yarana da yarana ngana yarana ya da yarana boda ba yarana